Hello, and welcome back to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my very favorite nonfiction books that you've probably never heard of. Now, of course, this being the most book-loving portion of the universe, probably chances are good that some of you have heard of some of these nonfiction books, but I would be really surprised if all of you have heard of all of these books. The ones I'm going to mention today do not have very many mentions on Goodreads. One or two of them, I was surprised when I looked them up, they actually had over 4,000, between 4,000 and 5,000 ratings on Goodreads, not reviews, but ratings. And I was surprised because they're not books that I have heard people talk about or even reference or mention. One of them maybe I've heard like referenced. It's kind of a classic, but generally speaking, I don't hear people talking about these books very much, except for in very isolated circles with extremely specific interests, kind of esoteric. However, I do think that each of them would be enjoyed by almost anyone. I enjoyed them, and they're not necessarily, I mean, I'm not like, you know, a kind of person who reads like really deep things on, you know, specific topics or whatever. I think that they have a wide range of people that they would appeal to. So you may find something of interest in this short little list I'm going to give you today. So with that preface, let's see. I'll start with the one that had probably the most ratings on Goodreads. So there's a good chance you've heard of this one. It's called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles MacKay. This book was written back in the 1800s. Yes, 1841. So, hey, would have worked for October, next October. Anyway, it's, he goes through history, the history of mankind, recorded history, and he talks about the various trends and things that took place at various points in human history. Some of them, many of them, which we look back and we scratch our heads and say, how, why, what were they thinking? It wasn't exactly what I expected. I was expecting more of like a psychological analysis of trends and why people hop on trends. Like, how do they start? This actually I'm very curious about. So if you know of a book that does discuss this, I would like to read it. Like, you know, if there's a trend, how does it get going? How does groupthink happen? You know, how like mob mentality, how does that come around? It's very, very curious to me about all of that. But that's not what this is about. This is really just exploring the various trends and things that happen, bandwagons that people jumped on throughout the course of history, and what happened as a result, and some of the key figures in each trend that happened. Let's see, let's give an example of some of them. So it starts with some like financial ones. Like there was the South Sea bubble in England, where there was like people, I guess they amounted to pyramid schemes. Like Charles Dickens alludes to it, or it's part of the plot in the book Little Dorrit, where people would just speculate on these ventures and end up losing a lot of money. And apparently it happened a lot. But this was talking about the South Sea bubble that happened in England. And then there's stuff like the tulipomania in Holland and the wide-reaching influence of that. Alchemists and the history. He goes through the whole history of alchemy. Oh my goodness. Fascinating and interesting stuff. Prophecies and fortune-telling. The use of magnets in curing disease. Then trends in politics and religion on hair and the beard, like just really super curious stuff. With the witch mania, which in the 17th century, well, I mean, like it even affected America with the Salem witch trials or whatever, that kind of thing. It was like worldwide, or at least in the Western world, it was like a huge deal. In Europe and the United States, all kinds of other stuff. Anyway, so he goes through those and he discusses them, looks into the history of each one of them. He's very funny. Like, I wrote little laughing emojis next to all the places that made me just laugh or chuckle out loud, and it was quite frequently. He has a bit of sarcastic humor. I didn't agree with all of his thoughts, mostly because, like, I think I came from a slightly different perspective than him. I think he looked a little bit, what's the word, askance maybe at older generations, ancient civilizations, like, oh, they were just cave dwellers, you know, kind of thing. They didn't really know what they were doing. I actually feel like mankind has degraded and devolved intellectually. We might have a lot of technology, but we don't necessarily have more intelligence than they did back, let's say, in the time when they built Stonehenge, for example, or the pyramids of Egypt. Things that we don't know how they did back then, how they made it or how they built it. And we still don't know. So I don't know why we think that we're so much smarter than they were, but it's a very prevailing idea. And it was definitely prevalent in Victorian times when they saw themselves as a very industrialized society, etc., blah, blah, blah. So I kind of disagree with some of his perspective on ancient times and some things regarding like science and the development of science or whatever. But fascinating all the same, and very interesting, in a book that I think about sometimes. Things that were mentioned in that book come back to me. So that's the first one. You may have heard that. This is another one that I think has I don't know how many, more than 1,000 for sure, maybe as many as 4,000 ratings on Goodreads. I think over 1,000. And this one is, it would appeal to several different groups of people. People who are interested in Russian history, or particularly the Romanov dynasty and how it ended, or people who like epistolary novels or biographies or memoirs, that sort of thing, and anyone who just loves history in general, be it Russian history or whatever. And that is called A Lifelong Passion. And I'm sorry, I lost the dust jacket for it a long time ago, so it's not a very interesting cover to look at. But I'm sorry, the sun is coming like right in my window there, so it's kind of making an interesting shadowy sort of effect here. But A Lifelong Passion by Sergei Mironenko and Andrei Maylunas. But it's in English. And it is all of the letters related to the life of the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, Nicholas and Alexandra, and letters they wrote to each other. Some of them were so sweet. They truly loved each other their whole life long up until the very end. Unlike many royal families, royal couples, they had a beautiful story minus the tragic ending. And there's Nicholas. This is all the kids. Where is the mom? Is the uncle? Alex. There's Alex. And that's her. And so anyway, it has like all of their correspondence. It has some diary entries and journal entries. It has correspondence of people connected to them. Very interesting, very fascinating, takes you all the way to the end. So I read this more than 20 years ago and just loved it so much. Really good book. And then let's keep going on the same kind of idea. I have a couple of more memoirs to mention here. One is The Diary of Fanny Burney, which had, I think, fewer than 500 ratings on Goodreads. This I just found so fascinating. So she lived in the 1700s. She predated Jane Austen by a couple decades in terms of her publishing of her books. Jane Austen read Fanny Burney and was obviously influenced by her when she went to write her own novels, which is why I read this. Such a fascinating life that this woman led. She wasn't like wealthy or well known, didn't have high standing in society, but she hobnobbed with everyone who was. So these pages are full of, oh my goodness, first-hand eyewitness accounts of King George's bouts with madness and insanity. So interesting. And how the whole entire court reacted to them and how they dealt with it, whatever. She was a lady in waiting for Queen Caroline. Is that King George III's wife? Queen Caroline, I believe. So she was in the royal court for many years, and she saw everything that happened there. She married a Frenchman, and she saw the beginning of the French Revolution and all of the changes there. She just saw so much history happen like right in front of her, and she writes about a lot of it in her diary. She met Samuel Johnson and other notable people of her day, and she writes about them. Some of them she considered friends. I think Samuel Johnson was kind of a mentor of hers. So people that she met were fascinating. Such a really interesting memoir. And then towards the end of her life, she got breast cancer, and so she had one of the first mastectomies prior to the advent of anesthesiology, anesthetics, that stuff. In other words, she was conscious for the surgery. I just cannot even imagine. I think I would probably rather die of breast cancer, I'm gonna say. I mean, I don't know. I've never been put to that test to have to make that decision, but wow. Anyway, this woman experienced a lot, knew a lot of interesting people, lived a very extremely interesting life, even though she was a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill kind of girl. And also she was a novelist herself. So yeah, very interesting memoir. If you are into memoirs, or if you like, I read it because I like Jane Austen. So if you're a big Jane Austen fan, you might like that. Or if you like to read people's diaries, that kind of thing. And then one other memoir, I don't have a personal copy of it, but I think I read it on, well, I read it on Kindle. The Memoirs of Madame Vigee Lebrun. And I don't even know where I found this. I think it was mentioned in another book I read somewhere, and it made me curious. So I read it. Or maybe I think I saw some of her art in a gallery. I think that's actually what it was. So she was an artist. Madame Vigee Lebrun was an artist, a French artist. I think, yeah, it was actually a similar time period to Fanny Burney. She was slightly before. Yeah, so let me back up. Sorry. I am like, history is getting rearranged here. So it would not have been, Fanny Burney would not have been at the beginning of the French Revolution. It would have been the wars with Napoleon that she lived through, and that she was like there in France for the beginning of that sort of thing. Anyway, she kind of like, because she was married to a French husband and she was English, like she kind of was in a strange position during the wars with Napoleon in the early 1800s. So yeah, sorry, had to restate that. But now let's circle back to Madame Vigee Lebrun, who did indeed live through the French Revolution, which was a little bit earlier in the 1700s. And she escaped. So I guess they still would have had like similar times, like they would have lived at similar times. I'll have to look up the actual years of that they lived. Anyway, Madame Vigee Lebrun, she escaped France, and because she was, you know, she was part of the wealthy nobility there. So she escaped France at the very beginning, I believe, of the revolution. But then she basically went around Europe, but she spent a good deal of time in Russia and then in other courts, in the European courts. And she was an artist. She did a lot of portraits and portrait painting. So she was hired by many like royal families, etc., to paint royal portraits. And so it was just the story of her travels throughout Europe and the royal families and the courts and the people that she met and the people that she painted and the places where she stayed and her impressions of life around Europe. Very fascinating. I think a little bit whitewashed. I don't think we get to know the real Madame Vigee Lebrun, but still very fascinating look into life, late 18th century life in Europe. She supported herself with her art. At some point in there, she left her husband because he like had basically control of her money. Like she earned all this money and then he was in control of it. So she ended up leaving him and just supporting herself and painting around Europe. And you can see her art in galleries today. So that is another one, a memoir, if you like that sort of thing, if you like history, if you like art, could be of interest to you. I found it fascinating personally. And then we have not a memoir, but a biography, which I mentioned in a recent video because I'm hoping to read The Hatbox Baby, which this month in November, which is based on the story of the biography that I am about to tell you. Sorry, that was a little complicated. So this biography is called The Strange Case of Dr. Couney. And I mentioned this in a previous video, so I won't spend a lot of time on it in case you've already heard me talk about it. But he was basically instrumental in developing the medicine and science of caring for prematurely born infants. And he had it was a very unique and unusual method that he had. He would, sorry, drink break. Need a little hydration. He would take his incubators that he either invented himself or based off a prototype of someone else's, or maybe just stole somebody else's prototype. Don't really know that for sure. But he was a bit of an entrepreneur, and he would go around to the world fairs and state fairs, etc., and he would exhibit his incubators, and whatever town he was in or city or whatever, any babies who were born prematurely during that time, they would bring to him, and he and his team would basically save their lives. And he saved the lives of hundreds of babies who literally would have been given up on in the hospitals where they were born, or by the doctors, whatever, who delivered them. They would have just left them to die because they wouldn't know how to take care of them. But his incubator system was extremely helpful, and he had like a very clean, sanitary environment, and people loved him. So there's some mystery surrounding him, some hints of scandal maybe. He wasn't really a medical doctor or a scientist of any kind, but you can't deny what he did successfully. And I just find it fascinating that he just worked outside the medical establishment of the time and successfully saved so many lives. And really, really interesting story, really interesting book. And I mean, it's kind of weird to think that people went to a fair and paid money to go see like a freak show, to go see prematurely born babies and see them being cared for. Like, I never thought to just go to the maternity ward at my local hospital just to see the little prematurely born babies. I don't even know if they'd let you. It's kind of weird, right? But still, at the same time, it's kind of cool. And I think it's so amazing what can be done for, you know, infants born as early as like 24, 25 weeks, and how they can save their lives and keep them alive and healthy. And then they go on to live long and healthy lives to one extent or another. It's just amazing. And the gift of life is certainly incredible. So I really enjoyed that biography. And I love biographies and books that are kind of like sorting through puzzles and mysteries of someone's life where there's incomplete information on the official record. So you really have to dig deep into other records of the time and newspaper articles. You kind of have to go like on tangents and rabbit trails to discover what is the truth about somebody. So I forget the name of the author, but you will have seen it on the cover of I put the cover up for you. But just a really fascinating look into this man's life and what he was able to accomplish. So moving on from memoirs, this is sort of, I guess, a memoir a little bit, and definitely probably the most esoteric book of the ones I'm going to mention that may be of interest to the smallest amount of people. But I found it so beautiful and wonderful, and I want to read it again, but I lost my copy somewhere. So I need to buy a new copy, and it's kind of hard to find. And that is called The Song That I Am. I forget the name of the author at the moment. Her name escapes me, but I know she was a French nun, And I think she was a French nun like in the maybe the 50s and the 60s, and that's when this book was written. And she has this very interesting, like almost metaphysical approach. She starts out the book by describing how she was taking a walk in the woods. I think it was like near her convent one day in France, and then she just heard, as clear as day, someone playing something on a violin, and it was a particular piece of music, like maybe something by Mozart or something. And there wasn't anybody there, but she like very clearly heard it, and she insists that it happened. But the whole rest of the book is basically her thoughts about humans and our relationship to art in general, but specifically music. She digs a little bit into poetry as well, because that ties in very well to music. But she's really essentially talking about music and poetry, and the relationship between humans and music and poetry, and the nature of music and how it affects us, how we affect music, the creation of music, the emotion attached to music, the effects of music. Did I say that already? Anyway, it's just very, very interesting. So if you are interested in that sort of a philosophical kind of book, which I'm not really into super much, but I found this very interesting. I'm gonna be honest, I did not understand everything that she was trying to say. I think because some of it was, like I said, she kind of had like almost a medieval metaphysical kind of mindset in her approach to music, which I think personally is kind of cool. But she also, it was written in French and then translated, so that could be like some things were lost in translation that didn't translate well, and that's why I didn't understand them as well as I would have. So I don't know, but I did find it interesting. I have written down some quotes and some thoughts from that have just really stuck with me from what I read about that. And I really want to read it again. So I have it like on my wish list to find another copy of it that's not an arm and a leg. I would really like to find it and read it. Anyways, so some of you may be interested in that. I don't know if that sounds interesting to you or not, but that is one that I have really loved. And then I mentioned in a previous video about this book, so I won't say a lot about it right now. Don't want to double up too much, but A Gospel Primer for Christians by Milton Vincent. And this one I think does have more than 4,000 ratings on Goodreads, but I think it's probably only like certain circles that have really like passed it around, but it's so good. And if you are a believer, this is really something that should be read and reread just to remind you of the truth of the gospel and how it affects you in your daily life. I am planning to reread that this December for Reread December. Rereading December. Forget the name of that challenge, but anyways. And then my last couple recommendations, totally different topic of conversation here, topic of book. I don't know if any of you are like, if you also like things like spelling and grammar and that kind of English nerdy sort of stuff. I'm not a big grammar person, but I'm a huge spelling person. I like spelling. I like the history of words, the history of languages, and I've read several books along those lines about language and the history of language, etc. And when it comes to the English language, I have read one or two books that I have really enjoyed. This one I heard about at a conference that I was at many years ago, and it's called Uncovering the Logic of English. And when I attended the author's session about this, Denise, Eide is her name, I attended her session about it, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is just so interesting to me. And I bought the book, and I never do that sort of thing. I bought the book right away. I mean, I know that's hard to believe, but it's true. I really don't just buy a brand new book just because somebody spoke at a conference about it or something like that. This might be the only time that happened. So yeah, it was that interesting. Anyway, so she's combating in this book the generally held idea that English is illogical. And it's true that there are many, many, many exceptions in the English language when it comes to spelling. She's specifically looking in this book at spelling rules. And her thing is that we have the wrong rules. That the rules are totally different. So if we have the right rules, English will suddenly become very logical and will follow all the rules, in fact. And when I read this book, I was convinced. And I'm a big phonics person. I love phonics. I taught phonics for a few years to kindergartners and 3-year-olds. And oh my goodness, I love phonics. I love the science of words and sounds, etc. I find it fascinating. So I found this super interesting. And she digs into, like, because, you know, English is an amalgamation of a variety of languages. So she digs into those roots, the Latin roots and the French roots and the German roots and the Greek roots, to understand why we spell certain things certain ways and why we end up with words spelled the way we do. The one that was the rule that was the most interesting to me, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so the spelling rule, I found it, that blew me away when I read it, because I had never heard it before and it made so much sense when I read it, was about adding suffixes to multisyllable words. So when you have a short word like hop, for example, and you have one vowel and one consonant, you have to add a consonant before you add the suffix, the vowel, right? Like, so like hop becomes hopping, you have to add a P first, or hop into hopped, you have to add a P. So how does this translate into words that have more than one syllable? It depends on where the accent falls. If the accent falls on the final syllable of the word when you add the suffix, then you have to add the another consonant. But if the accent is on the first syllable of the word, or any syllable other than the final one, then you do not add an extra consonant. So for the examples are the word metal, like a gold medal, kind of metal. So if you want to say medallion, the accent is on the second syllable, medallion, so you have to add another L. But if you say medalist, like she was the gold medalist, the accent is on the first syllable, so there is not an extra L in medalist. And then omitting. So omitting, the accent is on omit, so you have to add a T. But limiting, the accent is on the first syllable, so you don't add another T when you add ing for limiting. Preferring and preference, same thing. That's why preferring is spelled with 2 R's, but preference is spelled with 1 before the consonant. I mean, before the suffix. Same with conferring and conference. So isn't that crazy? So anyways, I never knew that rule. And that's the kind of stuff that sort of fascinates me. Along those lines, the last one I'm going to share today is called, I believe, A Dash of Style. And this one is about punctuation, English punctuation. But it's not really so much about the rules of punctuation. I mean, it is, but it's not, because it tells you how to break all of them and why you should break all of them and when. Kind of. I mean, that's not really the point of the book, but that's what ends up happening. So it discusses the rules of punctuation in English. But then the thing that I found most fascinating as a reader is that it goes through examples of novels and how different novelists, English novelists, since the beginning of the English novel, how they used punctuation differently for different effects. And it was so interesting as a reader, and it made me pay way closer attention to punctuation in novels after that, and to see which authors were obviously purposely using their punctuation in a particular way, and which authors were just, you know, normally punctuating like the average English person, English speaking person. So I found it very fascinating. It's written, its intended audience is probably writers or aspiring writers, or students taking a writing course maybe, because it had like exercises and activities. I didn't do any of the writing exercises and activities. I found it fascinating as a reader because it made me pay closer attention to how punctuation is used effectively or otherwise in novels and in the books I read. So if you are a reader, which I'm assuming you are, since you're here watching the video on BookTube, you may be interested in that as well. And now, I am running behind and I have things to do. So I am so glad that you stopped by today and watched this video with me. Please let me know. I'm dying to know if you have heard of any of these, which ones you have heard of, and if you enjoyed them, or if any of these sound interesting or intriguing to you and you might add them to your to-read pile for Nonfiction November or some point in the near future. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great day.